as reports suggest some absolutely monster revenue numbers for both OpenAI and Anthropic, but even more monster projections and, frankly, need to hit numbers for the future. We are digging into 15 questions for the business model shaping these incredibly important companies. Welcome back to the AI Daily Brief. At the core of all of the conversations around whether or not we are in an AI bubble is the question of the growth potential of the core model provider companies. Basically, we have a situation where there's this set of deals that are perceived as increasingly circular, that are all based on getting more compute and more electricity to power that compute, more data centers to deliver that compute, etc. But all of that is based on the assumption that that compute will turn into AI products that have enough demand to generate enough revenue to make all of that infrastructure build out make sense. So for that reason, people are paying extremely close attention to indications of how these businesses are growing. And the short answer seems to be like gangbusters. So we got two interesting reports this week, both of which dealt to some extent with revenue from these companies. The first was about Anthropic, and it showed just what an absolute tear this company has been on this year. Now, Anthropic started the year at around $1 billion in annualized revenue. That's where they were in the December-January timeframe. Over the summer, they nudged up to $5 billion in annualized revenue. And according to Reuters, they are now running at a $7 billion revenue run rate and are on track to meet a goal of $9 billion by the end of the year. 900x growth from $1 billion base in a single year is absolutely insane. And while they don't think that they're going to continue that unbelievably breakneck pace into 2026, they still do think that they can reach between $20 billion and $26 billion in annualized revenue by the end of next year. Okay, so that's the Anthropic story. OpenAI, meanwhile, began the year at around $5.5 billion and have now grown apparently to around $13 billion. Now, in any normal world, 0 to $13 billion in 3 years after the release of their core product would be seen as absolutely insane growth, and it is. The challenge is that they are projecting $100 billion in annual revenue by 2028. The Financial Times wrote a piece about the big obligations that OpenAI is putting on its back, called OpenAI Makes 5-Year Business Plan to Meet $1 Trillion Spending Pledges. This, of course, they're referring to all these deals with NVIDIA, Oracle, etc. Now, it's very clear that OpenAI isn't planning on being able to finance all of this just with revenue. However, as I said, they are projecting $100 billion in 3 years, meaning they are going to need to see a big uptick in revenue from where they are. And alongside the Financial Times article, we also got some reported information around the state of the business. $13 billion in revenue includes about 70% of that from consumer subscriptions and around 30% of that from the API. Of their 800 million users, about 5% are paying monthly or 40 million. They're also at a $20 billion burn rate. So let's talk about some of the interesting questions that I think this brings up that are more slanted towards the strategy of these companies going forward. So one question is, does the radical breakout success of Anthropic push OpenAI to be more aggressive about enterprise? In that Reuters piece, we also learned that 80% of Anthropic's revenue comes from the enterprise. They have more than 300,000 business and enterprise customers. They've recently announced big deals like the one with Deloitte, where they have hundreds of thousands of users coming from a single company. And given their 9x growth, the fact that they have gone from 1/20th or less of OpenAI's revenue to more than half of OpenAI's revenue in just 10 months has got to be pushing the question of whether there should be more emphasis on the enterprise from OpenAI. Now, of course, it's not like OpenAI has no enterprise focus. The company has even recently added a forward deployed engineer team that will go in and actually help companies build out solutions if apparently they are a $10 million or more customer. And interestingly, at Dev Day, Altman and Brockman did speak a little bit about enterprise. Brockman talked about how there were a lot of really boring enterprise problems that were some of the juiciest things to solve. And Altman talked about how they didn't just want FDEs to be bungling around, but now they feel like they really have a good idea of how to help enterprises, and so they want to scale that. All of that suggests to me that we might see at least a bit more enterprise focus heading into 2026. Now, of course, one of the interesting questions, which has a big stake in this strategy as well, is how much of this enterprise success is strictly anchored in Anthropic's coding prowess. For most of this year, really up until GPT-5, Anthropic were the preferred coding models by far and away, with Gemini models a distant second, and OpenAI models not really in the conversation. We've covered a lot about how that shifted, and it was very clear that a huge goal of GPT-5, if not the primary goal of GPT-5, was to redress this balance. And I wonder to what extent OpenAI sees coding as the Trojan horse for absolutely everything in enterprise and as the thing they need to focus on, even if their broader goal is more general enterprise revenue as well. Still, I don't think it's a foregone conclusion that OpenAI's only play is to double down on enterprise. The numbers that Anthropic is putting up certainly suggest how valuable that segment is, but at the same time, OpenAI really does have a unique position vis-a-vis consumer. For a huge number of people, AI and ChatGPT are completely inextricable from one another. In fact, ChatGPT is the term more than AI that they know. Aside from a few dips and blips, they've been the number one app for a huge part of their life since ChatGPT was launched. And every week that goes on, ChatGPT gets more and more deeply woven into the consumer experience. Now, one of the questions for a lot of people is how much more there is to be gained from those 800 million users. Max Sparrow, for example, tweeted, "Is it just me or is 40 million paying ChatGPT users kind of low? Spotify, for example, has 276 million paid subscribers. Just kind of surprised that there are 760 million people who don't feel like they derive an additional $20 of value from a more capable model." This to me, I think, is a really important question. It certainly feels like there is a lot more to be gained from these users. And my guess is that OpenAI is betting that the more valuable that these models get over time, the higher the percentage of users they'll be able to unlock and convert to a higher tier. But it also seems like they're not taking that for granted. And so another question that comes up is, does this make ads inevitable? My read, having watched all of these discussions, is that OpenAI really doesn't want to have to do ads, at least not in the traditional way. I think that they genuinely don't really want to be, strictly speaking, in the attention business in the way that Meta or TikTok or Instagram are. But I also think that they feel like it is to some extent inevitable and a huge source of revenue. And then certainly if you're trying to go from 13 billion where we are at the end of 2025 to 100 billion by the end of 2028, it seems like there are going to have to be new revenue streams unlocked that aren't just converting more paid subscribers. Certainly, I think that that brings up the question of how much revenue is possible from ads and what they need it to do as part of the overall mix if they were to go into this area. Now, one thing that hasn't been discussed as much is that it is possible that OpenAI finds some slight variation on the traditional ad unit experience that better befits the user experience patterns of interacting with ChatGPT and that make it less annoying and more palatable for users than, for example, big chunky display ads. Indeed, it feels like that's kind of what they're thinking about with their checkout with ChatGPT business and in general taking a cut of referrals from the part of the ChatGPT experience that's all about discovery. This definitely feels like a thing that they're going to do and an area where a version of advertising feels less disruptive of the user experience and more potentially additive or at least integrated with the user experience. And I wouldn't be surprised if that's the sort of template that we see when it comes to more traditional advertising style business models for OpenAI, is trying to find things that are more subtle and more integrated as ways to capture additional incremental value from each average user. I think one of the big questions for me is whether some amount of this solves itself as we just better understand what use cases actually drive the most value. In other words, I think that probably a lot of the users of ChatGPT are radically under-maximizing their use of it. And the more time that goes on, the more people around them will have figured out how to use it for more value, and the more likely they are to uncover some use case that's worth the $20 a month or whatever the price is for them to become a paid user. One of the interesting ways to look at the study that OpenAI did about how people use ChatGPT is through this lens of trying to understand which use cases actually drive the most value. Again, with an eye to, are those possibly the use cases that could be better monetized? There's also the interesting question, I think, of whether subscriptions in general are the right model and whether these subscription prices are the right prices for those subscriptions. To some extent, we're kind of all just living in the environment that Altman and OpenAI plucked out of the air when it came to pricing. They decided $20 a month for consumer and $30 a month for enterprise users sort of made sense. And then when they added a $200 a month premium subscription, everyone anchored to that. In other words, there hasn't been a ton of price discovery around whether these are exactly the right prices. And I think that there's probably some room for experimentation there as well. Now, on the enterprise side, one of the major questions, I think, is to what extent companies are going to prioritize just state-of-the-art models versus there's going to be more room for cheaper models for even production-grade use cases. My instinct is that we are right on the cusp of a threshold where big chunks of high-value use cases are completely viable with not state-of-the-art models, but with the newer, more efficient models like Claude's Haiku 4.5. I also think with agentic systems, they're going to start to get smart enough that they know which models they need to use for different tasks, and they're not always going to have to call on the most expensive models. We even got a little glimpse of how this type of organization might work when Claude Skills was launched, where one of the things that people are excited about for Skills is that they don't need a super sophisticated model to initially see a user's request and figure out which skills to draw from, making the whole experience more efficient for the user. Part of why I'm bullish on the enterprise use case, even for OpenAI that has such a distinct advantage in consumer, is that I just think that especially as the price equation gets figured out, we're going to see some amount of augmentation or automation across basically every core business workflow. And that is just a ton of tokens that can be consumed for revenue. Now, I should note it here at this point that I'm just talking about OpenAI and Anthropic because those are the ones we got revenue numbers from this week. Obviously, Grok, Gemini, and Microsoft Copilot are all in this conversation as well, and what they do could impact these questions. For example, one of the good reasons for OpenAI not to focus on enterprise so much is if they think that space is just going to be too outcompeted. One sort of interesting question that's more about how much these companies become a black hole for revenue in the sector in general is whether the foundation model companies like Anthropic and OpenAI are likely to siphon off revenue from the vertical apps or the other way around. Related to that, are we likely to see more verticalized products from OpenAI and Anthropic? We've seen the first indications of them dancing with that. Anthropic has released some industry-specific tools, but I think this is one of the big important questions for how this all shakes out. There are right now a lot of AI companies out there who have raced to 9 figures of revenue, coming up even on $1 billion, and whether ultimately the foundation model companies are a great big sucking sound that pulls all that in, or whether there's room for those companies as well, could also shape how this market plays out. I think related to that is the question of whether we're going to see these companies start to acquire their way to additional revenue. The Information this week also posted an article about how Anthropic is planning on doing more acquisitions. They wrote, Anthropic told investment bankers in recent weeks that it's getting ready to move off the sidelines and do more acquisitions. It is apparently considering M&A targets that could be good for its tech or for its end products. Still, at least for now, it does seem like the acquisitions that they're interested in are a little bit more on the technical side and less on the product side, but there's no saying that that won't change. Ultimately, the two big questions are these. The first is, can any company grow this fast? Epic AI Research dug into this and pointed out that we are in extremely uncharted territory. They wrote, OpenAI's revenue growth has been extremely impressive, from less than $1 billion to over $10 billion in only 3 years. We found 4 other US companies in the past 50 years that have done this, but of those, they point out, only Google went on to reach above $100 billion in revenue. Trying to find other companies that went from $10 billion to $100 billion in revenue in under a decade, they found 7. Google, Walmart, Apple, Amazon, Tesla, Meta, and Nvidia, but none of them even did it in 6 years, let alone 3. Now again, we are in uncharted territory, but it really would represent the fastest growth of anything that we've ever seen. Which brings us to our second question, what is sufficient growth? And by that I mean sufficient growth to make the market still have confidence in all of these deals and the big infrastructure buildout. This is of course a completely subjective question that could change wildly based on market conditions that have nothing to do with AI. Sufficient in this case is a barometer of investor confidence in the future, not any sort of hard or objective function. And so to some extent, if you want to keep track of where we are in the bubble cycle, I think the key thing to look at is how the growth numbers that we're getting from these companies compare to what is the inevitably moving target of sufficient growth. Look, ultimately, we are in completely uncharted territory, and the future is being written live as we watch. It is going to be a hell of a couple years, so buckle in, listen to AIDB, and get ready for a whirlwind. That's going to do it for today's AI Daily Brief. Appreciate you listening or watching as always. And until next time, peace